So you've heard of theater of the mind, but you're not sure that it's for you? Well, you're in luck. Because behind today's secret door, 3 good reasons why to try theater of the mind. So behind today's secret door, 3 good reasons why to try theater of the mind. This is Secret Door, a channel devoted to in-depth discussion about Dungeons and Dragons, and my name is Matt Morich. Alright, I have started a Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the channel, your help would be greatly appreciated and much needed. And many thanks to Marcelo and Doug for your support. The link will be in the pinned comment and in the description. So, theater of the mind is a funny term because I've been playing for a long time, for over 40 years, and I've never heard of this term until, I don't know, maybe the last 10 years. It's hard to know when this term came about, but to me, it's relatively new. It certainly wasn't when I was growing up that this didn't exist as a term, at least as far as I know. So if you are using theater of the mind, what you are essentially doing is you are not using miniatures or a playing board when combat happens. The primary delineation between theater of the mind and, well, regular D&D is just that. So instead of using miniatures and a battle mat, the DM explains to the players what they're seeing, just like the DM does in everything else in the game, except when we get into combat. Everything is done verbally in theater of the mind in combat. And that's what is the really interesting thing here. Now, my goal in this is not to say that theater of the mind is better. I love miniatures. I think they're great. I think that they definitely, certainly have a place in D&D. But theater of the mind is very special to me because I ran almost all my games and played in almost all my games growing up in theater of the mind. So to me, theater of the mind, I'm not saying that it is, but to me, theater of the mind is how you play role-playing games. Now, if you think about how D&D is played, the DM is describing everything, the players are all role-playing, etc., 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 and then all of a sudden you get to the big juicy part, the big pillar of play that everybody loves the most, combat, and now we turn it into a board game. It's weird. Now, I happen to love board games, so I can switch to that aspect of my brain and really have a good time doing that. But it's jarringly different than how the rest of the game is played. Theater of the mind, though, does have certain problems to it, and I'm not trying to suggest to you that it doesn't. It isn't going to be as precise as playing on a board with miniatures would be. It isn't going to be as overtly tactical. Certainly you can play with tactics in theater of the mind, but it isn't going to be as obvious. What you will get in theater of the mind is creative ideas, which could very well be tactical ideas. In theater of the mind, in fact, those kind of things will pop up all over the place. It's really kind of wild, the difference in how a theater of the mind combat plays out versus a standard miniature version of combat in D&D. So this is going to segue me into the first big consideration here. So number one, the first reason is you're going to save time. Lots and lots of time. Here's what happens in a regular D&D game. It's a player's turn. Then they start, generally speaking, are going to start counting squares either for how they're going to move or where the opponent can move to them, or they're counting squares for an area of effect spell, or they're looking this up or they're looking that up to see exactly what that next move is going to be. It's all very board game-y. And that is the sum of their turn. And it generally, after all the counting is done, then the announcement simply of what they do. If they're going to cast a spell, if they're going to use a weapon, or if they're going to, whatever the case is, they declare their action. Now, some players may do this pretty quickly, and they may not even have very much to look up or what have you, or maybe they have it all pretty well down or memorized. But in many cases, there will be players that will treat this like chess without a clock. they will take 5-10 minutes. That's, obviously sounds like it's an exaggeration, but it isn't always an exaggeration. It can be that bad where a player can take that long to execute their turn. That kind of thing really doesn't happen in Theater of the Mind. You may still have to look things up, but there's no counting of squares. You may ask the DM, what the range is between you and this target or what have you, but you're not, there is no sense of counting anything out. It isn't calculating. It is feeling. So when you're in Theater of the Mind, the players are having to roll with what you are telling them and giving very often it's going to be their visceral reaction. When it's a player's turn in Theater of the Mind, they can't wait. And they can't wait to roll the dice. They know what they're going to do, and they do it. As opposed to a player with miniatures and a battle mat, and they're going to look at it and they're going to count it out, being very careful to not make a mistake. Not always, of course, but your general turn, that's how you'll see things go. In Theater of the Mind, it's quick, quick, quick. Combats are much faster in Theater of the Mind, so you're going to save an enormous amount of time. Now, while I'm here talking about the battle mat specifically and everything else, and of course that's going to come up in the other 2 points as well, but obviously you don't have the precision in Theater of the Mind, and there are going to be certain abilities that may suffer, and some may even not be very useful at all, or spells or what have you, may not be very useful at all in Theater of the Mind. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, as a DM, it is your job to try to engage that. So if a player has an ability that clearly is meant to be played with on a battle mat, it's your job to try and figure out how you're going to be able to let them use that ability in Theater of the Mind. It may not come up as often as it would normally, but it should still come up. Now, I will give you a couple of ideas that might be helpful if you're going to run Theater of the Mind. So let's just talk area of effect spells. Area of effect is one of those things that it's going to, and it could be an ability, area of effect ability, but generally spells, right? So those are going to be the ones that probably suffer the most in Theater of the Mind over the battle mat. The battle mat is obvious. You will know exactly who's going to be affected. It's much more amorphous in Theater of the Mind. So here's a really good idea to do, and that is have a good idea of how many squares are affected. So if you have a 20-foot radius spell, that's 8 squares, so that's 64. 64 squares of possible targeting area. So when you're describing to your players how many opponents they're facing, and somebody says, I'm going to cast a 20-foot radius spell, how many will I get? And let's just say you've got 20 opponents for them to deal with, just to throw a number out. And let's say your idea would be that probably 10 would be affected. My rule of thumb would be, because the players are probably going to suffer a little bit from the lack of precision, is to give them a small bonus. So make it 12 instead of 10. Just give them a couple more that'll be affected by the area of effect. In general, my point would be, in this kind of thing, when things are imprecise or unclear, give the players the benefit of the doubt. Don't get them, the whole point in Theater of the Mind, really, is for them to feel like they're there. So the more they're thinking about the rules, the more they're thinking about how their abilities work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the more they're being taken out of the moment. And theater of the mind is visceral. It's your turn. Go. Do it. It's fun. And besides, one of the reasons you're doing this is to save time. So just keep things moving. And you'll find that what you do lose in terms of, and there's a real joy in the tactics of playing the board game version of combat, you'll find that what you miss from that is more than made up for in theater of the mind. So that's reason number one, is time. You'll save a lot of time. And number two, your players will role play more. Now, I'm not trying to say that players don't role play in combat if you use miniatures and battle mat. That would be absurd. But in general, and I've been playing for a long time and seen this happen over and over and over again, players could be role playing. The battle mat comes out and bonk, everybody switches into a different modality of thinking, and that sense of immediacy of their character has to almost be remembered to be employed. The first and most important thing on the battle mat for players, generally speaking, is to execute things tactically correctly. And of course, like I was saying in point number one, you get players that are so concentrated on making those decisions that their turn goes on forever. And so naturally, if all your thinking is going into these kinds of things, you're not engaged in role-playing. It's taking you out of those moments. So the combat that we all want in D&D, where it feels cinematic and everyone is engaged in a visceral sense, you are giving the players their best chance to do that with theater of the mind. It's certainly still possible to do with a battle mat. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Of course it does happen. But it's going to happen more often, and it's going to be easier and more consistently will it happen in theater of the mind. And I can tell that as a certainty. Now, I've DM'd for players that had never played before. And these are players that you would never think had a role-playing bone in their body, but we were playing the game. And I would run theater of the mind exclusively, and you would be shocked at how the players will just get into those moments. And because everything is happening fast and they're not worried about the rules, they're turning to you for the rules. Those players in those senses were just asking me, and I was telling them, and boom, 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 things happen, and they're playing their character. You'll get more life out of your characters in theater of the mind more consistently. I'm not saying it's objectively better than the battle mat, because the battle mat has its own thing going for it, and you can still get good role playing there. But if what you want is speed and character, that's reason number 2 for playing theater of the mind. And reason number 3, it builds memories. There are more memorable moments in theater of the mind in combat because the player is involved from the inside out in making those decisions in theater of the mind. So years from now, when the campaign is long since over and players are looking back fondly over their playing career, they will remember moments in combat that probably would be forgotten on a battle mat, because it's just another sequence of turns and in this different kind of level of thinking that people are just, it doesn't imprint. Those moments don't imprint as easily. I'm not saying they never do, but in theater of the mind, they're much more likely to. So what all this work you're doing as a DM is likely to have more impact on your players in a favorable way in theater of the mind. They're completely having to use their imagination in theater of the mind. And because of that, they're likely to remember those moments in combat much more precisely. And because there's going to be the more role-playing, and because things are going to be happening more quickly, and because things are happening more quickly, they're not going to be going on their phone as quickly if it's not their turn, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be more fun, more vibrant, and more memorable. So those are the big main points. And like I said, it does have some drawbacks. I'm not even trying to pretend that it doesn't. And I'm not trying to say that this is the way that you should exclusively run your games. By any means. I love miniatures, like I said before. But here's my big suggestion. If you're thinking of running Theater of the Mind, there's nothing stopping you from doing it right now, because you don't have to do it exclusively. There are going to be, if you have a big group of players and you have lots and lots and lots of monsters to deal with, it may be the best thing for that particular battle to pull out the battle mat, because you want to be more precise and more sure. The beauty of Theater of the Mind is you can just do it for any of the combats that you want. You don't have to pull out that battle mat every single time. And that would be my greatest recommendation. Mix it in. And there may be certain kinds of games where you go exclusively Theater of the Mind. But I think that in most campaigns, having that mix will really be helpful. And especially Theater of the Mind would be great for combats that are essentially like hand waves. They're just really easy kind of combats. Run those for sure in Theater of the Mind. There's no reason to drag this out longer by pulling out the battle mat. But if it's going to be like a deadly encounter and players theoretically really could die, then you might want to give them the precision of the battle mat. But then again, if you are running things with more of an eye of favoring the players, as I recommended earlier in Theater of the Mind, they may prefer that for the deadly encounter. My point is just to weave them both in. That would be my big, big recommendation. So if you haven't tried it yet, please consider it. You owe it to yourself to try it. It can take a little getting used to. I started right out of the chute with it, so to me it's second nature. So it may be a little more tricky in the beginning, but like I said, just give the players the slight benefit of the doubt in almost all cases. When these kind of questions come up, just give them the slight benefit of the doubt, and things should go pretty smooth. And you'll find it's a lot of fun. Give it a try. All right. Well, that's all I've got. If you enjoyed the video, please like, please share, please subscribe. And if you're stuck and you don't know where to go, you can always search for a secret door. Until next time, I cast bless on all of you.